This video is sponsored by Shortform. Does anyone really like the process of reading when all you want is to learn way more than what we have time for? I'm pretty sure that if you like absorbing knowledge, there are probably loads of books that you just haven't got around to picking up yet. Because of a busy schedule, procrastination, you get sidetracked from things, and it probably annoys you a little bit because sometimes there just isn't enough time in the day to learn the ideas you have always wanted to learn. Until you come across Shortform. Shortform makes the world's best guides and summaries for all the non-fiction books you would ever want to read. They're like book summaries on steroids. They're super detailed, so you get the book's key points at a deep level. They have interactive exercises to help you apply the ideas you just learned so that you develop a bulletproof memory in the process. They add smart insights like connecting what one author thinks about another to the point where you end up understanding the ideas at such a deeper level of insight that reading a book often just ends up taking longer to ultimately get a weaker understanding. To learn more than ever from important non-fiction books that you've always wanted to read, join me on Shortform at shortform.com/thoughtsonthinking. You'll get a 5-day free trial and a 20% annual sub-discount subscription if you use my URL at shortform.com/thoughtsonthinking, which you can find in the description and comment section down below. Now, to understand the importance of IOB devices with regards to this entire, you could say, agenda of societal transformation, you have to get an understanding of what Foucault was referring to, or how he understood or saw the way in which society has been structured and how it has transitioned into new structures over the past 300-400 years. One way in which he saw it during the 18th century era, you could say, or before the 18th century, before the Industrial Revolution, was that society was structured by sovereignty control, which would be feudal systems of control. That there would be a peasantry which would be bought out by kings and monarchs from all around the country in different locations, and what those peasantry would be doing would be working for the kings and queens and the monarchs in the agricultural lands and fields to get their wage so that they could continue on living, and that's how the peasantry would exist. And that's, in a sense, a kind of rough example of a feudal system. Now, obviously, when that moved on, when the Industrial Revolution began, the entire way in which we perceived reality also changed, as then what Foucault called disciplinary control came into being, into society, especially into Europe, because you had the Industrial Revolution and you had the development of factories, the making of factories. People would then go to the factories. People would then work in these newly developed technological societies that would start to develop from the Industrial Revolution. And what that fundamentally changed in our perception of society and how we live in it is that behavioral changes related to the body were influenced into society and how we saw ourselves in society, because people would go and work in the factories, they'd be disciplined through the body, in the same way that the machines in which they worked on were disciplined. They'd go to work for a certain amount of hours. People would go to school or start going to school more. People would be disciplined by institutions that would then have developed from the Industrial Revolution with the building up of many different forms of society from the Industrial Revolution. And fundamentally what happened from that was that people were disciplined. Prisons were developed. Disciplinary prisons. People were disciplined to have a certain amount of time in and out of their cells, when they would eat, when they would go outside maybe, or when they would, when would the school child have playtime, when would they be allowed to put up their hand in class. the ringing of the bell, they'd be disciplined. And thus, people were disciplined in this new form of society in which was being developed. And this is kind of still the case now because people go to work. They do the 5 to 9, or the 9 to 5. And people are disciplined in a, you could say, state of flow also, in which I think Deleuze called society in some sense regarding with the 20th century. Is that, you go on motorways, you drive your car, you're in a consistent state of flow in the regulation of society. But the purpose of IOB devices for the future of society is in some sense what that will do for society in its next evolution, you could say, is merge the two previous forms of society into a hybrid form and develop some sort of new transhumanist, postmodern, posthuman society, which would be based on the influence of the Internet of Bodies, which would be IOB devices like Fitbits, Apple Watches, the metaverse, being introduced into the metaverse and living within the metaverse, and living and participating in a hyper reality of what the world actually is. For example, some of the things that I just showed on the adverts at the start of the video. And this would then probably develop onto the next stage of civilization, which would be Foucault's idea of biopower, because what you'd be doing is you'd be attaining power on the biological level of the human individual through Internet of Body devices. And those Internet of Body devices would be collecting data that would be extremely intimate towards the individual, and that data, through its collectivization, would give the corporations a form of power. And that power would be the same form of power in which the sovereignty control societies would have had through feudal systems, but just reapplied in a different way for modern society today. They would have the data of the peasantry, in which would be the lower classes, and the monarchs in this sense would be the corporations and the institutions, like you could say the funding institutions like In-Q-Tel, which are funding all the technology of this kind of postmodern, not postmodern, but post-human technology. So in a sense, you would have still a hybrid of those two civilizations that existed beforehand, of the sovereignty societies which had the feudal systems, and the disciplinary control societies, which was from the Industrial Revolution, in which we very much still live in today. But there'd be a merging of the two. But then you could hypothesize that the sovereignty control systems, in which would be the corporations, in which would harvest all the data from the IOB devices, in which everyone would be using, or a lot of people would be using in the West, would then influence the disciplinary control of society in a new hybrid form through the use of these IOB devices of new modern technology. And that disciplinary framework could be an example of what the social credit system or score is for the modern new world. Because the social credit system would be the thing in which disciplines the individual in society and gets them functioning in society by moving their biology and their bodies in a particular way to serve society for a certain cause. And that is one way how the IOB devices, through biopower, creates a hybrid of these two ways in which Foucault saw the control of society develop over from the 18th century to the 21st century. Because you'd still have the kind of the feudal control systems of big hierarchical corporations, but how those corporations would maybe even be associated to governmental regulation, in which would then be associated to social credit score systems, and a form of soft authoritarianism embedded within Western society through the use of the Internet of Bodies, harvesting of data, intimate data, biological data, which would then convert into a form of biological power over the autonomy of the individual. But people also need to understand that things like IOB devices, in the consumerist way that they are promoted as being good and beneficial for you, is the synthesis to the antithesis in the Hegelian dialectic. It's like, well, no one actually wants this. No one wants this thing that is going to be tracking and tracing you. So we need to create a synthesis and a reaction to negativity, in which can then reintroduce the want and desire for those things. But to understand the commercialization of IOB devices, Internet of Body devices, is to understand the metaphor of what a Trojan horse means metaphorically, because it enters into the civilization beyond the walls of the castle and is accepted without really knowing the internal workings of what that represents and means for the society and the civilization in which it is entering. So that is the metaphor of what the Trojan horse is. But it is strictly a process of conditioning and predictive programming, in the fact that one would represent or show or require society to accept a certain thing, but if they don't accept it, then they pull back, and then offer the same thing that is disguised in maybe a different veil of intention, but fundamentally has the same process involved with it. So it's very similar to, like the process of boiling the frog is a metaphor, which is, trying to slowly condition society into a state of coercion or acquiescence without them realizing it, because of the continuous process of slowly boiling their own internal mental framework and changing it slightly over time. But it's also similar to like the way in which that can be represented as the metaphor of the boa constrictor, kind of like, it would strangle its prey, but then let go and then do it again. It's the same process. It's the same psychological process, at least. But yeah, that is basically all I wanted to say in this video, is to kind of basically illustrate to you that the fundamental ingredient to a kind of state of biopower or kind of soft authoritarianism with like social credit score, blah, 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 is the introduction and indoctrination and the creation of desire for IOB devices in the Western population. And how IOB devices are kind of like the Trojan horse, but also the kind of the end game, or the ingredient to reach that kind of end game of control by the state, at least. So that is like something very fundamental people need to understand. It's not many people talk about, because you see these commercializations of certain products that are exactly that type of thing, which are there to fundamentally, at first hand, indoctrinate you into accepting them and for you to enjoy and all of this, without truly understanding the primary reason and cause for their promotion. So that's all I want to say in this video. Make sure to give it a like, subscribe, comment your thoughts down below, and I'll talk to you in the next one.